This is where Stephen Lawrence was murdered in 1993. A memorial to Stephen was built into the pavement here at Well Hall Road in Eltham. It's still a case of great sensitivity. A CCTV camera monitors this memorial night and day. It was a terrible case, but then there were many terrible cases in the 1990s, but none have had the significance of this one. Many people say it changed the way we think about race relations. Some people say it changed Britain for good.
Within hours, police had the names of 5 suspects from 26 different sources, yet there were no arrests for 2 weeks. The failure of the police investigation in the period following Stephen's murder contributed to the outcome.
It was a watershed case for all sorts of reasons, and people forget what it was like living in Britain in 1993. There'd been 3 or 4 race murders in South East London, and I was working in the anti-race field, and what I was getting constantly is this brick wall from police officers and other agencies saying, look, this is not about race. These neighbours aren't complaining because there's a racism problem. They just don't get on. And so therefore it was almost impossible to get those in authority to accept that race existed as a problem. And what the Lawrence case did, if you take everything away, the one central feature was it made race mainstream.
This is a young black family who are married, they go to church, their children play tennis, they have aspirations for their children.
I suppose you're saying to wider society, this is what you want from us, this is the family that
you
say you want.
Yes, this is the family, you know, there are no scandals attached to them and all of that. Hard-working Neville and Doreen was then a student at the University of Greenwich. They're very articulate and they spoke up and said how they felt, and what had happened to them was unfair and unjust.
Suburban England had to accept that racism existed because Daily Mail, for example, put it on its front page and said, here it is, this is an issue which we have to accept and understand. And once it gets into Middle England, so to speak, then all of society has accepted it and recognised it.
I think it became symbolic of all the murders of young black men that have happened over really 20, 40 years in this country. And it was really because of what brought it into as it became an icon in a way, was because of that time when Mr. Mandela was in this country and the parents of Stephen Lawrence managed to get on television with him. And he made this terrible statement that the life of black people is treated in the same way as it was under apartheid in South Africa, which I think shook a lot of white people in this country.
In terms of the way we viewed the case, how important was that moment, do you think?
I think an absolutely defining moment. I think they suddenly made this case the one that was going to be the defining one.
For all the concern about the case, the police investigation went nowhere. That wasn't significant in itself. What was significant was the decision of the Home Secretary Jack Straw to order an inquiry.
What we were given for the first time as people who worked on anti-race issues was a blank piece of paper. Not this time saying, well, what's wrong with society, but what do you want done about it? What positive things? And it was then, I think, that we began to realise that we could make significant changes. And it was a huge responsibility on the Lawrence family in particular to make sure that what they came up with, the framework that they came up with, was one that was going to be a lasting legacy.
And did they see it in those terms?
I think we did at the time, vaguely.
The whole idea of the inquiry was so important in itself. The fact that Jack Straw had committed himself to Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence that he would give them an inquiry. He put a whole lot of his own personal influence into it. And when I came out of that inquiry, I really felt somehow it was, it's going to be magic. Everything's suddenly going to get much better. It's the most important thing I've done in my life.
And what surprised you? What did you hear? What did you see or hear that you didn't know before?
I couldn't believe that this was how a murder inquiry is done in London by the Metropolitan Police. So many decisions that should have been made weren't made, or if they were made, they were the wrong decision. And if there were any decisions made, there were no notes kept. If there were any notes kept, they were lost. Quite unbelievably unprofessional. All the behaviour, all the way along the line, from the top to the very bottom, we couldn't believe that was how things were. There had to be some other contributing factors. Insufficient evidence was presented to us to draw the conclusion it might have been corruption. So therefore, we were left with only one other possibility.
The investigation was marred by a combination of professional incompetence, by institutional racism, and by a failure of leadership by senior officers.
The Metropolitan Police Commissioner was asked to acknowledge institutional racism, and he would not do so. So William Macpherson asked him first, the judge, then he passed it on to Bishop John. Bishop John tried it a different way. He said, well, if you can give me a definition, then I can acknowledge it. And that, I think, immediately sent a signal to everybody, including his officers, that you don't have to worry too much about this. You give it a definition sometime or another, and we can pick over the words on that, but you don't have to make any real changes. I'm not really committing myself to this, I'm doing it reluctantly.
What Sir Paul should have said was yes, he believed that there was racism in Stephen's case, and I think from there we could have looked to move forward.
Despite the Commissioner's intransigence at the time, there was progress. Sir William Macpherson made 70 recommendations, most of which have been implemented in some form. More than that, he set a new tone.
Through the public inquiry was a paradigm shift in policing. I think it influenced the governance of policing, the way the police are supervised, the way complaints are investigated, with all the complexity of that. It influenced investigations, the first hour at a murder scene, influenced the leadership of policing. We changed the whole layer of how leadership was trained to think as a direct result of some of the evidence that Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence gave. It impacted internationally. A lot of people copied the family liaison systems. It changed the law on racially aggravated offences. You know, hate crime's still a big agenda item. It affected double jeopardy.
The media, the arts, football. I mean, if you watch football in the World Cup, I remember seeing anti-racist armbands on footballers. It's become global mainstream. It's come into the very heart of what British culture is, if football is seen as that. No one says it's directly because of the Lawrence case. It's the consciousness has been raised of racism in this country.
People did not like the term that they were racist. It's still a very unoffensive term to anyone suggesting that they're racist. Therefore, training started. People were asking for training. Teachers wanted to be trained, doctors wanted, even magistrates and judges. We had a whole cacophony of training. Some people talked about it as being unconscious racism. I go along with that. Some people are unconsciously racist. Others are overtly racist, like the people who killed Stephen, because they used the word nigger.
There'd been a great improvement in professionalism in the police. Some of the sloppy policing which we'd seen in the Stephen Lawrence case originally couldn't happen now. The training of detectives, for example, first aid, which is obviously dear to my heart as a doctor. All those things are much better now. But the same amount of time and effort has gone into the two recommendations that impact negatively on black people, on stop and search, the disparities in employment of black officers and Asian officers. And in those two areas, the same effort has gone in, but with no outcomes at all. In fact, if anything, things are worse now than they were 10 years ago.
How can that be so, if that amount of effort's gone in?
I don't know. I mean, the only difference between these areas of policing and all the others is that these are the ones that impact on black people. Disparities in stop and search, which are 4 to 5 times more likely to be stopped if you're black than white in 1999. Now they're 8 to 10 times, double. Now how does that happen? Every one of those recommendations somehow or another got undermined somewhere along the line.
I really didn't think that we would achieve everything in one short burst of immediate activity. It was going to be strategic, which means long term. But there's an awful lot of police officers weren't even in the police at the time the public inquiry reported. You have to keep revisiting some of these things. Institutional racism needed explaining over and over again to people because they misunderstood it. Some people just never grasped it. Some people accepted it at the time because it was politically appropriate and then decided that they didn't want to believe in it later.
It's changed. The racism that we experienced in the past has changed. It's changed in the way it is espoused, the way it deals with minority communities. The language has changed. People who want to use racism change the way in which they do it. It may be slightly more secret, but it's still there. My own view is I think there are other families like the Lawrences who are going through an experience similar to that which the Lawrences would have gone through in 1903. Because the police are still racist. They are still treating families badly.
But that is a sadness, isn't it? If the gains that the Lawrences have made don't apply to anyone else.
I agree, and that's the tragedy of it. It should do, and that's my job, or our job as a society, to make sure that there are people out there who don't suffer in the way that Lawrence's did.
What I fear is that society would rather forget it. And it is now upon the victims to put it back on the table every time there's an opportunity. I've heard black people say, I'm an MP who happen to be black. I'll tell you, brother, you're black and you happen to be a reporter.
Do you feel now that the Lawrence case changed the country in some ways, or at least changed attitudes within the country?
I think Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence deserved their OBEs for a very good reason. I think they educated this country what institutional racism is all about. Sorry, it's an emotional, passionate issue, this. See, I think that people who say, what's institutional racism? I say to them, if you were around at the time of the Stephen Lawrence murder and Stephen Lawrence inquiry, yes. Do you think that the police didn't try hard enough to try to catch the murderers? Yes. Why was that? Because the family are black. That's it. That's the whole point of it, institutional racism. That's all about. And I think they taught these people that black people have a different experience of policing and have a different experience of life in this country, but they deserve better. That's what they taught them. And I think that's the most important thing that's changed in this country as a result of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, is what Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence did to teach people that, that racism is alive and well, and this is how it operates, and people understand what it's all about. And that's a remarkable change in attitudes in this country.